unfortunately, we didn't have time for Steve Rubin to talk about Fred rewriting your Forbidden Planet issue. But if I can quote that story, you said that issue had so much detail. You said if they hammered nails into the set, you told them how many?
Well, no, I said we almost got to the point with that issue where we were counting the number of nails they hammer into sets. I mean, you keep giving Fred information, he'd want more and more. And I think in the history of retrospectives, no one has gathered more information than that.
Yeah, the Forbidden Planet is incredibly detailed.
You came away with that, not knowing something, we were in trouble.
David, do you want to talk about the Vincent Price issue?
What?
You want to talk about doing the Vincent Price issue?
Do we have time?
We'll give you a couple minutes. There's a spare chair. Come on up there.
Believe me,
I
we'll have
wasn't
time.
sure I was going to come up here.
We don't have a firm deadline.
We don't?
No, we don't. So
You can actually get Paul Salmon back up here, I
Oh,
think.
no, we don't.
okay, so we're kind of getting into the 80s, moving into the 90s and beyond. Cinefantastique went through a few changes. They'd done their first cover story on Star Trek was Star Trek II, which was in the same issue with Paul's Blade Runner issue. And then around 87, they did a retro on the original series, and that kind of opened the floodgates, because up till that point, science fiction on TV had not really been that much worth writing about. I think in their second or third issue, Cinefantastique did a look at made-for-TV movies that covered science fiction, and very dismissive, as most of them deserved to be at that time. But suddenly, we're getting into an era where they were reviving the Twilight Zone. And then after that, we're going to get Tales from the Crypt on HBO. And there's going to be Star Trek The Next Generation. And there's gradually there's a lot of high-quality science fiction stuff on television. And that becomes a much bigger part of Cinefantastique in that era. Too much. You heard Ted Newsom complaining a little bit about the continual Star Trek cover stories, because Fred found out that they were very popular, and there'd be years when they were bi-monthly and there were 6 issues, there would be a cover story on the new Star Trek movie, and a cover story on the current Star Trek TV series, and maybe a retrospective on the old series. And there would be like half your 1-year subscription taken up with Star Trek. And some people didn't like that so much, but it paid the bills. Anyway, so from this era, Daniel Schweiger, you worked a lot there in the 90s. We'll get to Jeff later because you came in at around 2003 and thereabouts. David was there in the late 80s working on one of the great
Is it the
retrospective
late
cover
80s,
stories.
really? Good
Yeah,
Lord.
the Vincent Price double issue.
We have
And
the late
then
80s.
Preston is back because he's going to finish the story he started to tell about what happened with the whole Star Trek issue. So let's start with Dan. You said you wanted to talk about how influential the magazine was with you and why you wanted to get into it. And
Well, my father managed a lot of really what you could call luxury hotels in New York City, and one of them was the St. Regis Hotel. And there was a really lovely newsstand right next to the hotel that I would, go through and rifle through the magazines. And I saw Cinefantastique there, and I think, as one of the commentators said, it was really like the Rolls Royce of genre magazines. I had never seen anything as beautifully done or designed or exceptionally well written, and also having quite a lot of naughty pictures in it, which certainly interested a budding 13-year-old kid. The first issue actually I bought was the Hans Salter issue, and precursing my own career in film music. And it was just something this is kind of like, I was also a big fan of Pauline Kael at the time, and it's just kind of like, I'm going to write for this magazine one of these days. This is what I want to do. I want to write at this kind of level, this top level of film journalism. And I went to Emerson College, and then I moved to New York in the late 80s. And I started writing for a couple magazines, Toxic Horror, Horror Fan, Video Times, Fangoria. And again, always with the goal of writing for Cinefantastique. I was like, I'll never forget, obviously, not only did you have a great John Carpenter issue, but you also had the Tanya's Island pictorial, which I will not soon forget. And I also didn't forget they blew the ending of the Empire Strikes Back, which created, I think, a lot of controversy at the time.
we think Fred was probably courting controversy deliberately.
Yeah.
He would do these spoilers and write these very disingenuous editorials about Well, our subscriber base is so small, there would have only been 5,000 people who knew about this, but the publicist got mad and, that blew it out of proportion, and suddenly I'm getting calls from Hollywood Reporter, and so the news got out. And I'm like, Fred, I think you were anticipating that exactly this scenario was gonna take place, that you were gonna start getting phone calls. So yeah, he gave away the ending, probably strategically.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I really admired about the magazine is a lot of the stuff was understandably puff pieces. I myself didn't like to get people angry at me. I still don't. So I wrote, very positive stuff. But again, I really admired, that see if you could be unblinking in terms of, talking about stuff that actually went on in the set. And I think I probably called Fred up and just said, I love your magazine. I've always loved it. This is the epitome of genre magazines in so many levels. And I started getting some assignments from him. I think I did a couple of reviews. I did, stuff like the opening of Dick Tracy. I did a retrospective on Carnival of Souls, which was, I think, one of the first major retrospectives of it. I ended up doing the liner notes for the soundtrack. But it meant a lot to me that, this movie that freaked the hell out of me as a kid, watching it like on UHF, talking to Herc Harvey and John Clifford and all these guys. And then I finally got to do the cover story for The Rocketeer, and I had always been a huge fan of any kind of superhero thing that took place in the 30s and the 40s. I mean, that was just it. I just loved retro superhero movies. And, I pretty much interviewed everybody. I was familiar with the art. Dave Stevens, I'd met Dave at a couple of comic conventions. Really lovely guy. And again, I really just wanted to do something incredibly comprehensive. I interviewed Craig Hoskins, the stunt guys, the Daniel Paul, the writers. I got to go to the set at Disney, which they actually just finished the club set in the big clamshell, was still there, and talked to Joe Johnston. And I'll tell you, the issues over there, but man, when that thing came out, that was like kind of, it just did not get any better than a magazine that made me want to become a writer. And finally, there it is. I think I talked to Fred a couple of times on the phone. He was always very nice. Just kind of, and I think when Fred went away, I think I kind of moved out of the whole magazine thing, and now I do liner notes. But when I do liner notes, I concentrate on the production of the film as well as the music of the film, and that's something that was instilled upon me by Cinemafantastique, to cover every angle, to cover it as in-depth, and to write insanely overlong pieces, that just basically got into everything. And it really, just my desire to become a journalist really started with Cinemafantastique magazine.
I think it's the Pat Broski article there's a copy in the other room there that she wrote in the LA Times. She said, Cinemafantastique article seemed to have been written for a precocious, 10-year-old who keeps asking, and how did they do that? And how did they do that? And so, yeah, every question will be answered by the time you've read the issue. So, David, I know I put you on the spot by dragging you up here. You didn't plan to be on it. But
Well,
David and I worked on the double issue devoted to Vincent Price.
well, we were neighbors too.
Yeah.
We lived across the courtyard
But
from each
your
other.
situation's different because you didn't get access to Price because of Cinefantastique.
Oh,
You knew
absolutely
him.
not. I had access
So
to
you
everybody
came to
long
Fred
before
saying-
Fred Clark
yeah,
came along.
yeah.
But I will tell you this. What I'm finding, sitting here looking at this sea of guys and two girls in here, a definitely male-dominated genre, as it's always been.
Mhm.
I go way back to Carlos Clarence, William K. Everson, Midi Minuit Fantastique, which is what Fred borrowed this from. Magazines have always been the fuel with which fanboys like us move along. And we are now entering an age of social media where magazines are dying. There's no more Video Watchdog, there's no more Fangoria, there's no more Cinefantastique. If it weren't for this boy here, Stephen, Cinefantastique would probably have gone the way of all the rest, but he is devoted to this, and I understand why. My relationship with Fred Clark was okay. He could be very difficult, as you all know. When we were putting the Vincent Price issue together, he demanded color from some, and I said to him, you realize, of course, that I have the largest collection of Vincent Price memorabilia there is because I'm friends with him, and we can't find color from Tomb of Lygia, so calm down. And he was like, well, I need color, color, color. Now, Benedict Tashin is the same way. Benedict said to me not 4 weeks ago, we could do an amazing Corman Poe book, much like what he's been doing with Tom of Finland for 50 books. But the thing is, we need color. And that is just the hardest thing to find. Now that we have Facebook and everything, there isn't a month that goes by that I don't beg people in Europe, if you have color trannies or if you have any kind of material, please get a hold of me.
Fred loved his illustration.
Well, he did, but I didn't realize, the thing I didn't realize about Fred Clark that was obvious with Forey Ackerman and certainly the crazy Cal Beck and his mom for Castle of Frankenstein. You're probably not, some of you remember Calvin Beck. He was a definite character. He worshipped Orson Welles and loathed the Vietnam War. And there within those two polar things were the way the magazine would go back and forth, and Joe Dante would write for it. And so these magazines were all very influential, and I loved them all. I wrote for all of them. But when we put the Vincent Price issue together, it was a constant trial of him threatening to pull the plug on it. To which I said, I don't really care if you pull the plug on it or not, but if you've gotten us all this far, and we brought Larry French into it as well,
Right, to get more
and
stuff.
eventually it all came through. And I still have the letter that Vincent wrote to me. He said, oh, I love that's the kind of centerfold I like.
Oh,
It's
that's
where
not
it's all
gonna make any
me,
sense
where it's all me.
Do I
And
have-
no, he loved, listen, I don't care what
Keep
the trouble with Fred, the trouble with all the other crap that went down with that double issue, and Steve knows from Steve Ravello with the Psycho issue, was also a lot of trouble. But the thing is, Vincent Price loved that magazine. He loved it, and that's all I cared about,
That's what he
was
said.
making him
Right,
happy.
he said,
That's
"This
my
is the kind of
favorite.
fold-out."
That's the kind of fold-out I like.
Yeah, that was the fold.
That's right.
That was his letter to you. Yeah.
Once upon a midnight dreary.
Yes.
Yeah, he loved that stuff.
That was the thing with Fred. You could deliver a great manuscript to him, and it would sit on the shelf forever because he didn't have the photos. I mentioned the Barbara Steele thing we did a while back. 90% of her career was in black and white. He'd be saying, well, can we get some more good color photos? I'm like, they really don't exist unless you're going to do poster artwork. You know, they're just not going to be that stuff.
Well,
it was similar with Vincent Price. You know,
one thing-
all those movies he did in the 40s.
One thing,
you know.
as far as, not the Vincent Price issue, but I'm sitting here looking at this issue of Salem's Lot. And I was a very close friend of Reggie Nalder, and Warner Brothers sent a limo to pick us up at his place in Beverly Hills. And we went to this, and I'm reading the magazine, and Fred allowed a quote from Tobe Hooper that was so awful. I had to tear it. I literally grabbed 40 copies of Cinemafantastique with a razor and just removed this before Reggie could see it, where Toby said, and I quote, "We were looking for the ugliest actor in Hollywood, and it didn't take us long to find him. His name is Reggie Nalder." And I thought, what the fuck is that? I mean, it's not nice. And, you know, I don't know what Toby was on at the time, but I will tell you this, I did a half an hour on this Toolbox Murders thing for a DVD thing, and I said nothing but nice things about Toby, so,
There you
know,
go.
and he got to see that before he died. But it was just like, you know, yes, Reggie was a peculiar looking man, but I don't think any of us would like a magazine that says you were the ugliest person on earth.
You know, for
That's
better or
just not-
worse,
that's just not
That
on.
was Cinefantastique was, you know, Fred's thing was, well, we didn't say it, we're just reporting what he said.
Yeah, but it's
He
called
never-
editing, that's
yeah,
what he was.
He
He
never
was an
shied
editor.
away from putting that kind of stuff out. I mean,
Sure.
that's what separated it from Famous of Monsters. You know, it was not going to be slavishly, fanishly devoted to what it was writing about. If something negative was there, he was going to print it, and that's the way it happened. And moving on now, I guess we did. You know, Fred left us by his own hand. It was you wrote the obituary. It was the year 2000, right? And you know, in retrospective, everyone who knew him starts digging back into their interactions with him, looking for, should I have seen the clues? His wife Celeste says no. You know, she's read things that he battled with depression for years. She says that's not true. Something that manifested very late in his life. I had left the magazine at the time that happened. I was working elsewhere, so he committed suicide. And there was this whole thing: is can Cinefantastique move on? At this point, the internet is starting to become a thing. You know, there used to be a time when, you know, we heard stories earlier about, oh, you know, I got to this preview screening of The Lost Boys, and I was able to write something about that, you know, before anyone else got it. And that's really gone now because, you know, in 1998, they kept that version of Godzilla under wraps until it debuted at Madison Square Gardens, and within an hour, there are 100 reviews on fan websites online saying how stupid it is, it's a giant iguana, blah, blah, blah. See if Q can't get those scoops anymore. So things were changing, before Fred died. And then his wife, Celeste, tried to keep the magazine going for a couple of years. Dan Persons, who had been the New York editor, took over. He tried really hard to keep it going. I think there's 1 or 2 issues Dan is really proud of, including the Spider-Man double issue, which was very nice. And but I don't think Celeste was interested in keeping it as a family concern, keeping it in the family. So within about a couple of years, it got sold to Mark Altman, who kept it going. And Jeff Bond is one of the people who was there trying to keep the old flame going. But I know you liked what Cinefantastique had been, but you really couldn't do that in this new environment. I mean, I think one of the stories you told me a while back was, you really liked the Logan's Run issue where they did the whole issue about it, and then,
Yeah.
what did Fred call that?
Well, that's, I think our first meetings about doing the CFQ were just all about, like, boy, we'd love to do this, we can't do that. Here's something we'd love to, we can't do that. So we were trying to, we did the review grid, but we didn't really have enough contributors. I think one of the, I'm not sure how Fred was like kind of paying a staff, but I sort of wonder now if the fact that we were actually paid kind of a living wage, and living in Los Angeles, it made the magazine sort of immediately too expensive to survive. But it's the Logan's Run issue was always the example of like, wow, they did an entire issue, had incredible access to Logan's Run, and on the first page of the issue, Fred Clark tells you it's a piece of crap.
The science fiction boom begins with a bomb.
So
That was
we,
Fred.
by this point, the publicity machine was much more in control of your access, so you kind of felt like, we were lucky to get access to anything. And we did try to do I think we managed to do 1 or 2 retrospectives. The one thing that I was proud of that we did was one on Dragon Slayer, and I got to talk to Matthew Robbins and Phil Tippett about that. We went to Disney. Dave Williams, who had run American Cinematographer, was the editor, and I went over with him to Disney, and we found a photo of they had built an 80-foot wing for the dragon that like unfurled. I don't know why you literally just see like 3 feet of it in the movie. This just wingtip, the corner of it. But we found this photo where it's like this magnificent, mechanical prop that I'd never seen before. And Mark Altman was the other guy who kind of bought the magazine, was running it. He had done a lot of the Star Trek coverage. And he sort of let me do that, so I got to do the coverage of Enterprise, my least favorite Star Trek show. But we it was really fun at the time. It was fun to go on sets. I got to go up to Vancouver on the set of Galactica and spend the weekend up there. It was very fun, but we didn't have the freedom. Even like when we would do the retrospectives, you just didn't have the amount of page length, and you couldn't reduce the font size to the size that Fred was able to do in those issues. So there was a limit to everything, and we always, I think, felt kind of sheepish. We were excited about it. We were proud that we were carrying forth the Cinefantastique brand name, but at the same time, I think we just recognized every day when we walked in that office that we couldn't possibly duplicate what had gone before. And so the coolest thing about working on that magazine was that we had all the issues of the original magazine in our basement. And I remember the day we started work, literally a semi-truck drove up, and we had to unload an entire semi-truck full of all the issues and all of the photos, research, and everything, except that Celeste had kind of kept all the good parts of that. So we were the first thing we were looking for was we got to find the Star Trek the Motion Picture story that never ran, and it was like, where is we couldn't find any of it. Like all the there was tons, and there was probably 6 drawers full of files of Star Trek photos and stuff, but just not the stuff related to that piece. So.
Yeah, for those who don't know, this is what it looked like during that era. They shortened the name to CFQ, I guess, because Cinefantastique was considered too hard to pronounce.
Too French.
And, you know, when this came out, I loved the look of it. I thought, you know, it's looked the same for so long, and I was always bugging Fred during my time with him. You know, let's shake it up, let's change it, let's modernize it. And I thought, great, you know, it's a new face of the new millennium. And the funny thing is that now Mark Altman totally regrets kind of what he did with his, like,
Yeah,
why did we change the name?
I
Why
think
did we get rid
even
of the logo?
even when we were doing it, he went back and forth on that, and there were, I think there were times when we were like this close to like, let's just use the original logo, and never wound up doing it.
Stephen, have you talked about the two spin-offs, Imagine Movies and Film Fatale?
I've referenced them briefly
Because what happened to Bill George? Does anyone?
he's still around. He's still around.
Is he still alive?
He's on Facebook. Last I looked. Yeah.
Because I've been getting texts from people wanting to know where he was. and
I
everything.
don't know, but you know, to get into the dirt, that was like Fred's last act before committing suicide. Was he fired Bill George from editing Femme Fatale's magazine? We talked before. You know, Fred did this because it was something he loved. He kept doing the retrospectives even though they didn't sell as well as putting Star Trek or something new on the cover. Femme Fatales was aimed for, like, I don't know, high school boys. You know, it covered women in low-budget science fiction films. It made a ton of money, and it ended up being published more often than Cinefantastique. So it was like subsidizing Fred's other work. But Bill George, any stories you've heard about Fred and Mike Kaplan and Jeff Renson rewriting writer stories were like 100 times worse with Bill George. You know, he would completely rewrite stuff. What he did, I'll tell you what, my personal story. I had an interview with an actor, actually, who had been in a movie with some actors whose film was being covered. And they said, oh, just send us the transcript. And when the issue came out, I looked at it. He had rewritten it into this first-person thing that had me, like, running around doing this stuff, looking at the call sheet, and suddenly realizing, you know, that this actor was in the film. And I said, this is nonsense. I didn't do any of this. It's all made up. And Fred was kind of like, well, that doesn't matter, does it? And I wrote this mean, angry letter that I told him, you know, you publish this or I'm gonna whatever. You know.
God, Steve, I didn't know all that stuff.
Well, and it turned into sort of, he agreed to publish it, but then he had second thoughts, and when it came time to, he kept faxing me with lines. You know, look, we're going to publish this part, but not that. And then 5 minutes later, another fax. This is in the days of fax. It's like, oh, and I'm going to cut out this part too, where you say this. And I said, you know, I said, Fred, stop. Give me 5 minutes. I'll get to the strict point. I won't trash Bill. I'm just going to say, I did not write this first-person stuff. I did not suddenly see a call sheet and realize this guy was working on the film. I knew that. That's why I was there in the first place.
Well,
You know,
Steve, do you
but that
remember?
was that was the stuff. So anyway, Fred finally, at first he said, don't worry about it, but then finally he got fed up. And so Bill lost a job, but after Fred died, they kept Cinefantastique, they kept Femme Fatales going for a while. And I think that was part of what was sold when Mark bought it.
Yeah.
Well,
that-
but I just remember the fun parts of, like, when we were living across from each other,
Yeah.
getting Martine Beswick over, and we
Oh,
went
right,
to
yeah.
that next apartment that had the big Chinese doors and photographed
Oh, right, yeah, we did-
Martine and
right, yeah, we did a
Martine
big photo
Beswick
shoot
and
for
all
Femme
kinds of
Fatales.
erotica, and it was it was fun.
There was a
It's gonna be
student
fun.
at FIDM, the Fashion Institute of Design, who had done a series of 8 dresses based on classic horror films. The birds, little birds, it was white and it had little tears in it that were bloody. And so I found like 8 actresses who were appearing in these films, and we did a big fashion photo shoot on that.
Did you
But
introduce
that
me?
did not go in Femme Fatales. That was in
Did you
Imagine.
introduce me to Florinda Kendrick, one of the brides
Right,
from
one
the
of the brides
Coppola
of
Dracula?
Dracula,
She
yes.
took me to the opening of Coppola's Dracula in Westwood, and the guy from Columbia Pictures came up and said, "You're not her husband. What are you doing with her?" And I said, "Listen, don't worry about it. We're just friends." But the
Well,
point,
that
the
is the
point
thing
was,
about, you met people through
I met lots of
Cinefantastique,
people.
you know,
It was.
and-
It was.
and you
I
weren't
just remember
even-
it being fun. You
Because
know.
you really did that one issue with Vincent Price, you weren't involved in that, but yeah, still, it pays residuals, you get an entree. into
Yeah, it's a
meeting the
nonstop.
Bride of Dracula and so
Yeah.
on, so it's kind of a cool thing. So that was what was happening with Cinefantastique, you know, from 2003 to 2000, trying to keep it alive, but in a totally different environment where it really wasn't possible. But you did the best you could, you know, and you did like the Omega Man retrospective, and so
Yeah.
there was some good stuff
We
that
did
came
some
out of
good.
it.
I remember we were maybe the funniest thing, sort of in retrospect, was we were covering Sky Captain and the Worlds of Tomorrow, which I was really excited about. I thought it just seemed like an incredibly cool project. We got really good access to it, and I remember they had this big kind of press day where we went over and we went over to this facility, and there's all these people like working in computer workstations, generating all these like amazing looking shots. And I found out sort of later that they, were really farming all these shots out to like every visual effects company in the probably country, because they were so far behind and desperately trying to finish this film. So I realized, in retrospect, this was sort of like that scene, in The Sting, where they build the entire casino and it's like all fake. They're just trying to like convince people that they're doing something. So,
Okay, so Preston, you can see, is back up here. We talked to him at the beginning about the Star Trek cover story that never was, but it did not remain in the drawer forever. So what happened? How did it finally emerge? And it was like a year or two ago.
Well, in this hall, we have my two angels who made it possible to finally see daylight. Taylor, who introduced the whole event, and Lucas Kendall, maestro of film music. Mind you, the word had gotten out over the years that it existed because he had promoted it so much. As we're going to do this as a special issue. Every once in a while, over the years, people would see my name online and they'd write to me and say, "Are you the Preston Jones who?" And I'd say, "Yeah." And they'd say, "When are we ever going to see that?" Well, these are the two gentlemen who made wishes come true. Now, there's any number of reasons why I'm glad to hear that mine was not the only manuscript that sat on this shelf for a while. I was not only sending him pages, I was sending him photographs and storyboards and all kinds of visual material from almost everybody that I interviewed. No one knows what happened to that. And for years, though, he was still saying that he was going to publish it. And one reason why he was telling me that he was still going to publish it, mind you, I think I mentioned he kept saying more interviews, so that's why I ended up with 60 interviews instead of 20. And I tried to edit it the way the gentleman edited his Close Encounters issue, not Q&A, just a montage of memories of all 60 people. All of that took time. If you want, I don't want to bore you with those details which are put in the book, but he did say that he told me that he wanted to print my material on The Night of the Hunter. Notice, do we all know, or some of us know, what The Night of the Hunter was? Classic film.
Yes.
The only movie Charles Lawton directed. Fred wanted to do a special issue about that too, and he knew that I had been interviewing Mitchell and the cast and crew of that book. And he sent me artwork painted by the same Roger Stein who painted Salter and Star Trek, showing a scene from the movie. And he wanted to have me sign on the dotted line and commit to that. I kept saying, well, let's let the Star Trek issue come out. And he kept saying, well, when you see what a great job we do with the Star Trek, you'll know that I'm the guy who's got to do your Night of the Hunter material. Cut to 2000, the year 2000, I was able to get a book deal for the Night of the Hunter book. And so for the first time in years, I contacted Fred. I'd seen him in person a couple of times, once in Oak Park, and once when he came out and had a bash here in Hollywood. And the rest of the time it had been correspondence and phone calls. And we were on good terms all this time. And I contacted him and said, well, now's the time if you still want to do something with Hunter. And he said, oh yes, definitely. But I could tell from the negotiations and just from talking with him that he wasn't the same Fred that I had known, the same guy I would see smiling from Christmas cards with Celeste and the kids. I got the feeling that the whole different shape of the business that David's talking about was taking its toll on him, and that the magazine wasn't entirely the labor of love that it had started out to be. And he also made it clear that, he's so tight.
Everybody okay?
Yeah.
Continue.
Things fell over. Hold it.
And so he also made it clear that although he was going to print some of my material on 900, that it was no longer going to be the big special thing that he had originally wanted to do. So it was sort of a wistful experience, this whole correspondence. And we actually got into a bad moment during the correspondence when something I said about what I had said with the Salter article, that I would like to have the opportunity, if you have anything to change, let me know and I can make the changes myself. And somehow he got that into his mind that I was trying to usurp his place as editor, and he sent me an angry email, and I wrote back to him and ameliorated him and assured him that was not the case. And so we signed the contract, and the last message I got from him, he had signed it, your friend, Fred Clark, something he had never done before, and I was very touched by. And then I went out of town for a couple months, and I came back and heard that he had killed himself. I just want to ask one question to anybody and everybody here. How is Celeste doing, and how are those kids that were smiling at me, all those Christmas cards?
They're grown up and they're fine.
Well,
I-
his collection of memorabilia is over $1 million. I had no idea he had so much stuff until
He had
it
a lot of
started.
posters.
It
yeah.
turned up on eBay, $1 million easy.
All
So
of those
I don't
additional
know.
things that I said.
No,
to
he
the Star
had
Trek
posters
people.
that were worth hundreds of thousands
I'm
of
saying
dollars.
that all the Star Trek material just was missing when the time came to do the book. So who knows
Yeah, I
what
don't know
happened
about
to
the
them.
Star
Probably got sold.
Probably.
Dan, what do you
I
think?
just actually want to give a shout out to someone who's in the audience. One of the issues, again, I was heavily influenced by so many of the wonderful issues that came out in the late 70s and the 80s, and one particular issue that really made an impression upon me was that one over there, which is the Primevals. And in this audience, we have Chris Endicott, who is the keeper of all things David Allen. And I think the Primevals stands as like the longest, just reading the wonderful coverage of that film back then, I think the Primevals stands as one of the longest unmade or unrealized films ever. And that might be coming to an end.
It might be
So-
finished someday, yeah.
Might
'Cause
be actually
that
finished.
dates from like '78. That was the pre-production on Primevals, and the film still is not.
Yeah, even on CFQ, we would joke about how we were gonna go let's do some more
The
Primevals
follow-up
coverage.
on the Primevals. We're gonna bring the Primevals.
I mean, the other, speaking of Dan, I mean, the issue that probably blew me away the most of the later issues was the movie poster. Like, is the person who did the movie poster issue here?
Rebello?
That was Steve
Stephen
Rebello.
Rebello.
Yeah, that
Steve
was
Rebello.
just absolutely mind-blowing. Just getting through that I mean, that was like 5 Passion books
Oh, we
put
were
into
just.
one.
Jeff was just saying that the issue that influenced him
The-
was the Selling Nightmares.
Yeah, the movie,
issue.
that's
That's
just an
that's a
incredible,
great one.
I had never seen anything like that before, and, that's just another, issue that showed the range of possibilities that Cinemafantastique could cover.
Fred stuck by that stuff. Yeah,
Yeah,
and
incredible.
indulging himself. I
And
mean,
I know, it was not a huge selling issue because we had so many of them. There was just tons, like, take all you want, but I was just like, this is it's
Stephen,
absolutely incredible
did you know
artifact.
that he collected to the degree he did?
No.
I don't think anyone, he was a world-class collector, and
well,
no, I
the people
didn't
who
even
worked
know.
with him
Yeah,
in the office did.
the collection was there before along with the magazine. He had actually finished collecting by the time I joined the staff.
Mhm.
He had, like I said, a full basement full of posters and stills that predated, they were, I think, from the 60s and 70s.
No, it's in-
He had a ton of 35 millimeter movies down there. too.
Right,
Bunch
he had
of cans.
prints, he had all kinds of stuff. Yeah.
Well, when Celeste started turning that stuff up on eBay, it went into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. I was stunned because he would always, when I would talk to him on the phone, it was always like, I need money. Man didn't need money.
Well, he
you know.
needed.
I mean,
liquid
but
assets,
he
yeah.
did, he was like paper rich, is what
But
he was.
collectors don't sell.
Right, they don't
No,
sell.
they die.
He never
is what
sold
they do.
anything.
Thing, yeah. Yeah, I mean, the thing you have to remember is, Fred didn't have backers. He didn't have deep pockets. So yeah, he was cheap with his writers, but if he had an issue that sold really terribly, he would have been in, deep trouble. I would talk to him about, you should be paying people advances and, kill fees. And he'd say, yeah, I know I should, but I can't afford to. I mean, it was pretty much a self-financed thing. It's not like, you know, somebody was backing him. If he had a couple of issues that did really badly, you know, he was gonna be in debt and maybe not have enough money to do the next one. So, you know, he kept things, you know, afloat for a long time. And I think what happened in this later period, you know, of Cinefantastique, when Fred was still around, was it had gone from being a sense of wonder to this is my livelihood, I've got to put something on the cover that's going to sell. And, you know, the fans weren't as happy because they wanted to see more retrospectives on their favorite 1950s science fiction film or 1930s.
Part of the problem was, in the time I was there and shortly thereafter, the way he sold the magazine was different. At the beginning, it was all direct sales to comic books, no returns. So when he sold 100 copies to a comic book distributor, those were sold. And if the comic book distributor sold none of them, that was a comic book distributor's problem. Shortly after I left, Fred, we expanded and we kept selling to more and more regular newsstands. And there was a deal at Barnes & Noble at one point. We got on, he put an enormous risk to sell through conventional newsstands because you have to accept returns, which means you spend the money to print and you get nothing. And you have to buy shelf space at major newsstands. And you know, if he could get in the old days, if something didn't sell that well at the newsstand, it really didn't matter because 80–90% of his sales were subscriptions or direct sales. By the time I left, it was much more newsstand sales where he was taking a risk.
If,
and I think,
if memory serves, the Selling Nightmares issue was the first one with the B. Dalton deal you mentioned, which was probably not a wise choice to go with the retrospective on that, which had great appeal to his core fan base, but wasn't something that some casual, you know, viewer or film fan was going to see and, you know, pick up and buy. And I think at one time he'd said that was the worst selling issue ever, but there were others that came along later that were worse. So, but you know, that's a great kind of back issue seller. It's like people who are interested in coming along and say, oh, that's something, that's historical, that's something really important. What Jeff's saying.
Steve, if you were alive today with all this amazing renaissance of House of Marvel and DC, what would can you imagine what the magazines would look like of Thor and Wonder Woman and all?
Fred would not be happy. I mean, when the first Superman came out, he was like, before it came out, he was like, in one of his editorials, the next big science fiction film is based on a comic book, for Christ's sake. Was, you know, his response, you know. Fred was into like 2001: A Space Odyssey and Zardoz, you know, these really weird cult well, not all cult, but you know, something that was challenging or intellectual, you know, that was more like a literary science fiction. He wasn't really interested in, you know, spaceships blowing things up, and I don't think he grew real happy with, you know, Marvel and DC and all that stuff. He put them on the cover, but at that point,
it made money,
it would be. It's like a job, you know. At a certain point, it was like, I need something on my desk in time to get the magazine out in time, and it really didn't matter to him if it was something he was excited about or not, because, you know, there was an issue after that and an issue after that. It was like, it was a factory. He was turning things out. And he felt like as long as he got it out on the stands before the film came out and people could see how bad it was, the sales would be okay, if not great. So there were times when, you know, it's, oh God, why did you put this on the cover? And it's like, well, at least we got it there before the movie came out. If it weren't for me, he would have put Steel on the cover. You remember that was the comic book? Black guy, in the comic books, he replaced Superman after the death of Superman. And they made a movie, and it was like about TV movie level quality, or less. That would have been a cover story if not for me, because he thought, well, we'll get it out before. And you know, I said, but Fred, the day it opened, it was barely made it into the top 10. That kind of indicates there was no interest in it even before people saw it, you know. So I got him to do Contact, the Jodie Foster film, on the cover instead. He didn't want to do that because it was going to have been out 3 weeks by the time the issue hit the stands. But it was still making more money than Steel did, you know. It was still more popular. I'm like, you know, you got Jodie Foster as a major star, it's Robert Zemeckis who's a major director. Let's go with that and forget about beating the film in the stand. And I think the right decision, because if you were now like going online and saying, I'm going to buy on eBay an old issue, I don't think you'd be picking up the Steel issue. Maybe Contact.
Does everyone remember the George Powell movie that was not made, that was like,
Vanishing.
where the sexes are separated between two dimensions, and they're basically men and women trying to figure out how to have sex between. There's a painting of a guy with an erection apparently having sex with an invisible woman on the other side of this dimension.
There's some
Probably the most insane movie concept ever.
But wasn't that
sound
based
like
on a
George.
Philip Wiley novel?
Yeah. It's based on a famous
Based
science
on-
fiction writer's book, and it was this seemed like something Fred would have been interested in. It's a very
Yeah, I think
conceptual science fiction kind of
We have a comment
piece.
from Paul back there.
Well, it's more a question, since I didn't really get to explore.
Oh,
I
God.
didn't see a few as much as I'd like. We're kind of glossing over, and I think part of the heritage and interesting history of Fred was his prickly side.
He was prickly.
Because Fred could do things where people would never write for magazine.
Yeah.
And I'm certainly one of those people. And basically because by the time Dune came out, I had been kind of a publicist and some other things for the studios for about 5 years. And I was constantly, at the same time, concurrently writing cover stories.
Right.
And I did Dune, I was in Mexico City for almost a year on that. And David Lynch did not want anything about the Guild Navigators of the Worms to get out. So I was the one bringing people from a lot of the different magazines down for junkets and stuff. And really sitting on that and writing my little journal, which got rewritten. And, I'm sorry, I just kidding.
And so how did this lead to?
But I open up the magazine, and there's like 10 photos of the navigators and the worms. And what Fred had done has gone under the table, talked to someone in the art department, and paid him $50 to send these photos, and he never told me. So I opened this up, and I've just spent the last year, right? I got fired from Universal, and I wound up in a whole court case with them and everything else. And I remember the Twilight Zone crash, exclusive photos, Twilight Zone tragedy, that kind of stuff.
Well, Fred. Yeah,
there's-
but the thing about.
this is not sour grapes at all. I certainly can go.
Okay.
But it is something.
He was
I think that-
prickly.
Yeah.
I know. I'm not saying he wasn't.
A lot of people stopped writing for it.
Well, no, that's true. But what I was gonna say about that is, I mentioned before, it was Fred's baby from the beginning. He wasn't working for someone else. It was his thing. His attitude was always, it was my magazine. I'm gonna do what I want. And he did that with publicists who tried to influence him about, well, do you really want to write the story about why Steven Spielberg's Night Skies production never happened? Wouldn't you rather write about Raiders of the Lost Ark? And he was like, I'm not going to spike this story because you're offering me something else. And he would be happy to slam the phone down on someone and tell him, fuck off. And he knew enough people in the industry where even if the studio publicist blacked him out, people who did effects, people who did makeup liked his coverage, and they would feed him stuff under the table. Steve Rubin?
I've got a story that matches your story, Paul. I wrote a book called The James Bond Films.
Oh,
yes. It's history. And Cubby Broccoli didn't
Can everyone hear? Should I give him a microphone?
He's fine.
Okay.
Cubby Broccoli didn't like the book. He didn't like the fact that other people had been interviewed telling their story, so they withdrew all the still cooperation. So I'm sitting there in the early part of 1980 with a great book, no photos. Of course, it was dead in the water. I found photos. There's a way of finding photos, and but Fred picked up on the fact that there was this controversy. So I'm spending a lot of time trying to repair my relationship with Cubby Broccoli and Michael Wilson. Fred takes an ad out in the magazine without telling me, where he puts Cubby Broccoli's photo in one of those telescopic sites. It says, who is this man and why did he want this book stopped? So Michael Wilson almost ran me over with his car. They were just so upset, and it ended my relationship with the Broccolis, and I've done several books on Bond, but I've never been able to repair it. And it's just, he just liked to stoke controversy, and for some reason, he thought it made the magazine more attractive, and it just pissed people off.
I think his wife said to me briefly in an email exchange that, Fred thought, it was a small magazine, small assets. The only thing Fred had to lose was his freedom of speech, and if he didn't use it, what was the point of having it? So he was happy to, say whatever, write whatever, and if people got upset, that probably made him happy. And it didn't always make the writers happy because maybe Fred could avoid dealing with the publicist, but if you were writing for multiple outlets and you were someone who worked for Cinemafantastique and you're trying to deal with 20th Century Fox, who was mad at him about Star Wars and everything else, that could have a lot of impact on the writers, and a lot of people were upset about that. Don Shea looks like he has a follow-up.
Add to that, when I was the Hollywood correspondent, I mean, I wrote a number of pieces for Fred, but I was also in the studios hustling photos and connections and all this kind of stuff. Estelle just reminded me, she had just read Fred's opening salvo here on Close Encounters, which I had spent 6 months working on. But it was one of the personal frustrations for me working for the magazine. I mean, he never rewrote my stuff because I told him if he did, I never wrote it. So that was not an issue. But I was out there hustling the studios for photos from him. And after a while, you go into the studios. I would have been developing these contacts and first of all was schmoozing and making friends with the people in the still department. And I go in, trying to get images for Cinefantastique, and they, say, well, for that asshole, they hated him, So, his readers may have liked him, but it was not easy representing that magazine.
No, it was very difficult. When William Peter Blatty was working on what eventually became The Exorcist 3, it was going out through Fox, and they didn't want me on the lot. They didn't want me talking to him, but coincidentally, he was doing a book signing at a bookstore like right across from me, and I went over, introduced myself. So I was able then to go to the publicist and say, well, William Peter Blatty personally said to me he wants to do the interview. So, there were ways to work around it. But yeah, you couldn't always just call up the publicist and expect them to help. They're like, no, we don't want anything to do with you, get out of here, no photos, blah, 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 blah. It's a recurring story, and over here.
Do the artworks, the paintings for the covers, do they still exist?
Yeah, but I think they were all sold off at auction. That's one of the other behind-the-scenes stories of Cinefantastique. Fred paid very poorly for the cover art, like $600 a page, but part of the contract was he insisted on keeping the original, and some people were fine with that, some people weren't. So if you see certain artists, like if you look at the little masthead cover by, you'll see a lot of people who only worked for him once. They didn't want to give up the artwork, but some people like R.L. Stine did several, and David Voigt did a ton of stuff. But my understanding is that was all paid for out of a separate checking account. It was kept separate from the other assets. So when the magazine was sold to Mark Altman, the posters weren't involved, and at some point after that, they kind of went on auction, and that's where Celeste made the money to, get her kids into college or whatever.
I'm glad you put in a good word for Roger Stein.
Yeah,
because he was an unsung hero.
are we getting where we should wrap up?
Yeah, I think we're
I
coming
have one
to the end
story I
here.
want to do, though, because I see Michael Beeler here. Do you want to tell the
where
Stephen
is he?
King story?
What, the Stephen King story?
About how you got him to talk to us after I got him not to talk to us? Okay, let me give the preamble first. Stephen King was covered a lot in the magazine. He was one of the people that Fred tried to stay nice to, tried to stay on good terms with, until Sleepwalkers came out, which was a god-awful movie, and they were billing it as Stephen King's first original screenplay. And I guess he was really proud of it. And I wrote a capsule review that said something like, if not for the Stephen King brand name, this film would have made its debut on USA Cable at 4 a.m. after something called Bikini Beach Vampires. And then Fred sent him a letter asking for an interview about his next project, and Stephen King wrote a letter back. You want an interview after that mean and pointlessly nasty review you wrote about Sleepwalkers. Go away and don't send me any more letters. So for years, we covered King, but no interviews. Somehow, you got Stephen King to talk to Cinefantastique again.
I really didn't get him to talk to me. He walked away from me time and again at cocktail parties. What we did is we got an invite to ABC Previews Week or something at the old Radisson in Pasadena, and they did a group interview with like a room full of 200 writers. And then after the interview, they sent you a book of like 60 pages of all the quotes. And I used that quote along with art from the effects guys, and everybody else talked to us, but Stephen King wouldn't talk to us. He hated Fred.
Yeah, but you told the story about you sat down at the table with the director Mick Garris, and eventually King came around.
Yeah, after the whole interview was done and the cocktail party was going on, and everybody that was in the movie, Mick Garris was there, and God, I can't remember everybody. Yeah, we sat down with Mark Altman and Mick Garris, and we just started chatting. And Stephen King finally opened up, and for some reason during the interview, he kept on kicking my foot. because I was sitting right next to him, and the whole time he just kept on doing that. And I got some great quotes, some great interviews from him, and his fan club eventually called it probably one of the best coverages of his film career. And if you've ever seen The Stand, there's people that like it, people that hate it, but it was fun.
Mick Garris, another writer who
Right.
stopped working for Fred.
Right, yeah,
Went
he
on
went
to
on
much
much
better
better career,
things,
did direct Sleepwalkers, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So I guess it's good Mick's not here, because then I
Yeah,
could
you
just
gotta
go to
let
that
that go,
quote of that
Steve.
review.
Let it go.
He actually wanted to be here. He's just traveling. So he was ecstatic that we were actually doing this. And I am going to wrap it up. But Paul makes a great point that crashing into Fred was a rite of passage. We all left on absolutely horrible terms. I don't know. Dan Schweiger might be the only one who didn't.
We were fine.
Really? Okay, you're the lucky one. I was bodily removed from a screening of a James Cameron film at the request of Mr. James Cameron because of my association with Cinefantastique. So, but the happy ending here is that if Don Shea hadn't crashed into Fred, there would be no Cinefex. If Primevals hadn't made the cover of Cinefex, Chris Endicott wouldn't be sitting here coming to the tail end of that 35-year ordeal. So you look at these walls, and I look at Dune, and I think, oh my gosh, Paul, Future Noir would not have been written if it weren't for us going to this incredible campus of Cinefantastique. So, I hate to end on that note, but
Well, let me end it this, let me put my spin on that. I've been joking to people that were interviewed that my take on Fred Clark was he was the Steve Jobs of Cinefantastique. Jobs was famous for a terrible management style, and when his biographer confronted him about this, he said something like, but look at what we accomplished. So Fred was not always good on personal basis. He could be charming. Fred was a true believer. As long as you were on board, if you were on the train with him and doing what he wanted, if you were Jeffrey Frenzen and he wanted you to stay up all night to get that issue out, fine. But if you said, well, I really need to sleep now, Fred, then he could explode and go crazy, and So as long as we were with him, as long as we were doing what he wanted, as long as we were believers in that little cult, he could be really great. Like I said, the management style wasn't always so great. Somehow I survived it, but I think he would just look at the accomplishment and say, these are some great issues, and yeah, maybe some feelings were hurt along the way, but that was Fred.
Taylor, as you were speaking, I'm reminded for us old movie buffs of that scene at the end of Bad and the Beautiful, where they hate him, but they're suddenly listening to him on the telephone.
Yeah.
That's the end of the movie, yeah.
So Fred, in a lot of ways, was like that Kirk Douglas.
He was.
Yeah.
And my favorite little nugget of information, just so you guys know, and we can wrap this up, is I bought my first issue of Cinefantastique at Equicon, 1976, not realizing till today that I bought it from Steve Rubin's dealer's table. So, full circle. Thank you to Steve Bedrowski, fantastic host.
It's easy when you have good guests.
Yeah, this was fantastic. You guys, Merry Christmas. There's food and drinks
Thanks
right around
everyone
the
who
corner.
came.
Hang out as long as you can. Thanks, you guys.